Hi everyone, my name is Gianna. I am currently a first year student studying geophysical engineering, and my topic today is 2D seismic wave acoustic simulation using finite difference. So when my mentor and I were carrying out this experiment, we used this governing equation. This equation is called the second order acoustic wave equation, and it describes the relationship between the acoustic pressure fluctuation, the partial velocity, and the spatial coordinates. So in creating the wave propagation graphs for the experiments that we carried out, we had to do certain steps to make sure that it was executed correctly. So firstly, we found the dimensions in the x and z directions. Then we took a look and chose the elastic parameters, the velocity of the wave, the time step, which is the change in time in which the governing equations are being solved in the program. Then we need to identify the location of the source, the frequency of the wave, and the excitation time. And lastly, the absorbance boundaries and the thickness of the layer. Okay, this slide shows the source function that was used to generate and excite the seismic wave field. So as we can see from the graph, the highest amplitude was recorded at 0.1 seconds, and the frequency was calculated to be 10 hertz. Now, this source function was generated over the time length of 6.6 seconds. So in this slide, you see an image. This image was generated on MATLAB, and it shows our first experiment. So my mentor and I, we decided to place the location of the source at the middle of layer 2. So all of our experiments consisted of 3 layers, the first layer at the top and the last layer at the bottom. In the x-axis, we have the eastings, which is in meters, and in the y-axis, we have the depth. As you go down, it gets deeper. So based on what we defined earlier for experiment 1, this is the image that was generated by MATLAB. And so this is the wave field of the experiment. So we have a source generating a seismic wave field. This wave field then propagates through time until it hits the top and bottom reflectors. The wave field will be reflected back from the reflector, and the other part will be transmitted into the top and bottom layers. The reflections are described by Snell's law, which we will talk about a little bit. And the reflected wave at the top has a lower amplitude than the reflected wave at the bottom. So taking a closer look, this was a snapshot that was taken at time 0.5 seconds. So just above the star, we have the reflection. Just below the star, we have the reflection of the wave. And at the yellow colors are the transmitted waves, and just around the image we have the absorbance boundary. The concept of Snell's law is one of the major concepts that we saw in the wave field of experiment 1. So Snell's law is used to describe the relationship between the angles of incidence and reflection when referring to light or other waves passing through a boundary between two different mediums, such as water, gas, or air. So when we take a closer look at the image, we can see the black line, which is the incident P wave coming in and hitting the interface or the boundary. And we can see then that some of that wave is that it passes through the boundary, so it goes into the green layer, and some of it is reflected. So going back to the wave field, we noticed that some of the wave was transmitted, some of the wave was reflected. In the previous slides, we were talking about transmitted and reflected. So my mentor and I, we decided to put in a slide with the topic, the concept of transmitted and reflected coefficient. Because with waves and in this experiment, it's very important to understand as well the transmitted coefficient and the reflected coefficient. So the transmitted coefficient is a measure of how much of an electromagnetic wave passes through a surface, whereas the reflected coefficient is a measure of how much of an electromagnetic wave is reflected. So as we've seen in our wave field, some of the wave was transmitted, it went into the second layer, and some of the wave was reflected, it went back into the first layer. This is a second experiment that we decided to carry out, but we placed the source at the top layer, top of the first layer. So we decided to do a different experiment because we wanted to see how much it would change based on the source of the wave. Because this experiment is slightly different to the first experiment we carried out, we took a snapshot of the program when it was running at 0.2 seconds. So this graph is at an earlier time, as I said, of 0.2 seconds before the wave crosses the first layer. So this is the initial movement of the wave from the source, right? So this is an example of the wave as it approaches through the source at an earlier time, and it has a higher amplitude after being reflected based on Snell's law. So we discussed Snell's law and we discussed the incident and the reflected wave. So this is just a snapshot of the program at an earlier time. This is the wave field of experiment 2. So we can see that it's slightly different, primarily because the source was placed at a different location, but this is at 0.9 seconds. So we can notice the color changes compared to the first wave field experiment. And at later times, the amplitude of the reflections are decreased because of the reflection coefficient. Because if you'll remember, at the wave field at experiment 1, we did not do it at 0.9. We did it at an earlier time of roughly 0.5. So we can see, at a later time, we'll have some differences with the color and the shape, etc. So in conclusion, we simulated the acoustic seismic wave field for 2 different source locations. We demonstrated the concepts of Snell's law using the reflected and transmitted wave, as well as the concept of reflection coefficient and transmitted coefficient. Thank you very much for listening.